In this video, we're going to be painting an urban landscape using just 3 colors. Now, painting with a limited palette is one of my favorite exercises. It's a great way to practice your kind of basic watercolor techniques, brushwork, mixing, layering, without worrying too much about color mixing or worrying if you have the right colors. It's also a great exercise in learning what is actually possible with your colors. You know, we often have so many colors, but we're not really aware of how many different options there are to mix. So the ones we're going to be using today are cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, and alizarin crimson. These 3 are pretty nice because they're quite neutral colors. And I'm pretty confident that using just those 3, I can mix pretty much all the colors you see in this picture. Now, if you want to skip ahead to the painting part, it's around the 17-minute mark. But for now, I'm just going to get started with the pencil work, ink, and then the painting. So you can see here, I am just throwing in some pencil lines. If you have seen the video I have on composition, that will give you a few ideas and explanations why I am, moving certain objects to the right, why I'm leaving out certain buildings, and just some overall tips on how I like to arrange things on the page. But at this stage, I'm just putting in the pencil just to show the location of the different buildings. Not worrying about detail. In fact, everything is either a rectangle or a triangle. I really do recommend this if you're sketching and painting outside. It's a great way just to sort of block off parts of the painting. Now, for this, I'm using my Pilot Parallel pen. This is the 2.4mm version. And I'm just starting in with I think it's a church spire. I think so. I've not actually been to Stockholm, Sweden, where this picture is from. So I'm not entirely sure. But I'm just loosely throwing in some marks. Now, I usually work left to right, but for this, I thought I would focus in on that church spire, just because I really think it's the part of the picture I want to give the most attention. So I want to give it a little bit more detail, and I also want to make sure I've got the size right. Sometimes with these pictures, I don't get the main object. The size is not quite right. It's always a delicate balance in the ink stage. I always ask myself the question, how much detail do I put in? What do I leave out? What do I include? Now I'm going to move on to this building in the foreground. So notice how I'm using the side of the pen, and that really helps to get a lot of those thick lines. Also gets a nice variation in line as well. But when I want this, the most basic style of line, I just use the edge of the pen, like the corner of it. I mean, that's great for details, but it doesn't really give you much line variation. So if you have this pen, or you're using any kind of Pilot Parallel pen, I would recommend varying up the direction and angle. Now you can see I'm not being super exact with how I'm drawing the green roofs of these buildings. I do want it a little bit more abstract. And you can see even on the church spire there, I've exaggerated the proportions to make it look a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more interesting. Now I've decided to cut off the second of those buildings. I don't really feel like it's adding anything, having 2 of them. And sometimes if you have 2 of an object, it can look a bit awkward. 3 is fine, 1 is fine, but 2 doesn't quite sit right with me. So I thought I'd just subtract a few little marks for people there. Now don't worry if you're drawing this and you feel you don't have enough detail. Great thing about Inkwork is you can always go back in later and add as much detail as you want. So you can see here, one of the things I really want to get in is these windows on the roof. So I'm making sure to put those in. But if I want to go back into those walls and add in more detail later, I can. No problem. Now, notice the horizon line is near the bottom of the page, and I'm just going below it now where this bridge is coming, and you've got a bit of the fence along there. So I think it really, really is important to add in some of these objects that show perspective. They also function really good as leading lines to draw your attention toward a certain point. Now, same thing as the building below. I'm not going to draw all of this building. Now, I could do, but I think it would take away the attention. Whoops, sorry, that's my camera shaking there. If you're curious how I film these videos, I've just got a camera on a tripod pointing down, and sometimes my head hits the camera, which is what that shaking is there. Okay, let's move on to the left-hand side of the picture now. Awkwardly, I'm going from right to left, and I am right-handed, so I've got to be careful not to smudge any of the ink. Now for this roof, you can see getting in those thick lines of the shadows already. And we're adding. Our pen's running out of ink a little bit. I'm taking a similar approach to the roofs as the other buildings. I'm exaggerating a little bit. And when I draw these chimneys in, they're almost like little spikes, just giving the impression of a chimney. This is one of the benefits of adding in the pencil lines as shapes, is that once I've drawn in the accurate shape with the pencil, that kind of frees me up with the ink stage just to go a little bit looser and a little bit more wild. Now moving on to these small buildings at the front. Now these are getting a bit closer to us, so I need to remember to make the one on the left a bit larger. The same approach here, just using the edge of my pen, or the corner, sorry, doing a slightly exaggerated roof. Looks a little bit wonky, not quite in proportion, but that's okay. And my perspective is a little bit off with that building, but that's okay. Doesn't have to be perfect for everything, as long as the general sense of the picture has kind of correct perspective. Now again, remember I can always go back in with a bit more detail. Right now I'm just getting in the basic flavor, if you will, and basic shapes. Second building, now remember this is going to be larger because it's closer to us, but exactly the same approach. And similar to the other side, I think I'm not going to draw the whole of this building. I really like to cut off kind of the edges of a picture because I think it gives a little bit more focus. Now you see if I'd drawn that building on the left here, if I'd drawn it completely, I think it would distract your eye. Really, these buildings are kind of they function in a useful way for kind of leading your eye toward that central spire and that central building that's kind of a turquoisey green. Now, if you've not done the video on perspective, I would really recommend doing that. If you're not feeling that confident with changing or warping perspective. Perspective is one of those things that if you know how to do it, then you feel very confident not doing it. I know that sounds a bit counterintuitive, but it's kind of true. All right, so we're getting more of these perspective lines in, essentially. We're just adding a bit of detail to that background building. I've got to be very careful. I want detail, but I don't want too much detail. So if I add in too much detail, it's gonna bring that building forward, and really I want it slightly in the back. Windows, again, just small marks, nothing fancy. If you find yourself drawing each individual window exactly, maybe it's useful just to sort of step back a little bit. Just look at the big picture. Now, there's a few features from this tower that I need to get in. One of them is the clock face, a few other windows. So what I'm doing now is really I'm just going back into the picture and adding in details where I think it's missing. We've got the basic architecture, the basic structures there, but we are missing a bit of detail, like on this roof. Let's add a bit of the lines there. And same thing for this bigger building here. I mean, they just really help to show direction as well, and they kind of show the shape of the roof. Without those lines, it can sometimes feel a bit flat. And that's my shaky camera again. And I've got this building in the background, and really doesn't need much detail at all, but I do need to just ink it in so I know where to paint. Because it's in the distance, these windows are more just the side of the pen, really. Barely anything. Just a bit more detail, kind of fake detail for the top of that spire. And now I'm just using the side of the pen here just to throw in a few shadows underneath the roof or underneath the arches of the windows, just to kind of get started on the shadows. Really useful to use this pen to kind of lead your eye. I think that's looking pretty good so far. So before we paint, I'm just going to dry off the ink. Sometimes the Pilot Parallel Pen can catch on the rough surface of the paper, my sketchbook, and they can create splatters. So it's really important that I just quickly dry this off. Make sure everything is 100% dry before I start painting. So notice how I've not used all of the page. I've actually kept a lot of the page blank. And again, I think this is a compositional choice. It helps to keep the focus only on a certain area of the page. A lot of other painters, they love to use masking tape. They love to paint the entire page. I like to be selective. The way I see it is it's kind of giving the painting a bit of breathing room. Now, before we start painting, I just want to remove some of those pencil lines. So I have this really nice putty eraser that I use. So I'm just going to use that to take off a few of those marks. So I often go slow at the start, and the reason I do that is because I get a little bit worried that the ink isn't 100% dry. So I just sort of test first, but now I'm confident it is, I can just go quicker. So that's looking pretty good, like that. So after everything is off, we can get started on the painting. Now I'm just using a bit of water to activate the watercolor paints here. Now the brush that I'm using is this Escoda travel brush here. The exact model will be in the description of the video. Now we're painting with 3 colors, so we've got to be careful how we mix them. First of all, I'm going to start with the sky. So let's wet up a bit of the sky. Now this water is a little bit dirty, you can see actually, but we can rescue that. And we're going to put some ultramarine in for the sky. So just a simple blue. And as with any painting, I'm going to start with the lightest values first. So that's the sky. And I'm just using a bit of water to kind of loosen up and blend in a bit of that water here. So we're going to go with the sky, then we're going to go with the buildings. You can see from the picture that the sides of the buildings are about as bright as the sky, if not brighter. So just adding in a bit more of the sky here. Now, typically the sky is a bit darker at the top, so I think I might even add in a little bit more ultramarine blue. So I'm adding in some cadmium yellow here and more ultramarine blue, and this creates this kind of green effect. Now this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm using for the roof. And cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue tend to make a nice green, and you can see here it's about equal mixture, 50-50 each. And that's the first roof, and that roof there is quite a warm green. Now if we move over to the other 2 roofs, they are more like a turquoise. So just a bit of water there to blend off that roof. And for these roofs, I'm going to add in more ultramarine to that mixture and a bit more water. So we're creating more of a cooler green, more like a turquoise. And we're just throwing that on here. So already with these 2 simple colors, we've got 2 very different kinds of green here. And again, water to blend. Now I'm just cleaning off a bit of that palette just to make a bit of room for the next stage, which will be the brick. So cadmium yellow here, and a bit of alizarin crimson, sorry. And this is about 50-50 now. We're just making this nice warm brick mixture. Now making sure to cut out those 2 buildings at the front. We're going to leave those white. So, and this is why using this small Escoda brush is helpful. So again, cutting out those buildings, adding in a bit more cadmium yellow, and a bit more alizarin crimson, and a dash of ultramarine blue. And what that does is it will desaturate those colors. You can see that this part here is a little bit more in shadow. And just adding in a bit of water to make that a bit more pale. And again, the tops of those buildings. So I do like to use water to blend in a bit of this. So remember, this mixture, the second mixture we're doing now, is a bit darker, or it's actually a lot darker than the sky. And the same is true of this grass here, more cadmium yellow to that green mixture. Remember, this needs to be a bit darker, more intense than the roof. And a bit more ultramarine to that brick mixture. And we're using that for the walkway and the bridge. So really we've just got 2 mixtures here, the green for the roofs and the warm for the bricks. And as I add more ultramarine, to that warm mixture, it's still got that kind of warm base. So a lot more, and this is going to be for the river. And this isn't a very bright or vibrant river, or in fact I don't want it to be, but it is about the same thickness of paint as the brickwork. Now more ultramarine blue here. And I'm just adding in a tiny bit of those shadows. Now remember, because these buildings are more white than the others, their shadows will need to be a bit cooler. More alizarin crimson, more ultramarine blue, and we're just going to add in a bit of this for the roof. Now if you look at the reference photo, you'll notice the roof of these two buildings is darker than the shadow on the left, so we just need to acknowledge that. And I'm just throwing in a bit of wet on wet here, just to create a bit of diversity. We don't want these flat blocks of colour. Now, let's tackle this spire. So it's in the distance, we want it to be cool, so let's add more ultramarine blue to that mixture. Maybe a tiny bit of alizarin crimson. And we can use the tip of the paintbrush here, because we're more drawing now than we are painting. But notice how the thickness of this mixture, as we add in more ultramarine blue, is thicker than the sky. This is very, very important. In order to get that contrast of that spire against the sky, the mixture for this kind of second layer needs to be thicker. Looking good? So you can see we've got this kind of nice grey mixture using just ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson. And I'm just using that same mixture, just throwing it in wherever I feel needs a bit of a pre-shadow. More ultramarine, more alizarin crimson, and a tiny bit of cadmium yellow, and this creates this kind of brown mixture. So remember, we don't have Payne's grey, we've only got 3 colours, so I have to kind of create this, this grey with what we have. So that's pretty much the first layer done. So now the next layer is going to be the shadows, but I just need to dry this off first. It is quite important that the layer is completely dry before we move on to the next layer. Now, if you want the paints to blend together, that's absolutely fine, but for this, I want these nice clean layers. I want nice sharp shadows. Now, I'm actually going to clean off this palette here. This is a small travel palette. I think I need a bit more space to work with. I don't have that, so I'm just going to remove that paint. So the next stage now, we're going to do the shadows. Now, we're going darker with every mixture, or should I say thicker with every mixture. So this next mixture of shadows needs to be darker than the buildings we put on. So as long as we remember that, we'll be fine. So I'm just going to use ultramarine blue. This is a slightly smaller Skoda brush now, and a bit of alizarin crimson. And you can see this is very, very bright when I use both of these colours. So we add a bit of cadmium yellow just to neutralise it a bit. A bit more to make it a little less vibrant. So this should be thick enough. Let's do a test. And that looks good. So I'm going to start with the background shadows, and you can see here that this background building is really helpful. It actually cuts out, or it feels like I'm cutting out the other buildings. So this is quite a delicate painting now. Nice, and you can see the warmth of the orange coming through. Other side. Now don't worry if this doesn't look dark enough, we can always come back a bit later. And I'm going to add in a bit more shadows for that spire, same mixture. Might come back to that spire a bit later to add another layer. We'll see how it looks. Now, more cadmium yellow to make this a bit warmer as we move towards those foreground shadows. I'm going to start with this building here. Now you can see this shadow is kind of blending in with the shadow in the background. That's not really what we want. We can correct that a bit later. And we're going to repeat for that other building. Now notice how I've not used this shadow for the roofs. We need something a little bit different. So I'm going to add in a bit more ultramarine blue to make it a bit cooler. So I'm trying to simulate the kind of shadow that's on there. We don't want to use the same shadow for the different colored objects. And we're going to paint this on here. Make sure to cut out a bit of those highlights where the light is catching that window, or where it's catching the raised parts of the roof. Sometimes it's helpful to print out the reference image so you can see it in a lot of detail, because we've moved on from big shapes now. Now we're starting to look small. So again, that background roof, we're just cutting out. Now if we go a bit too heavy with this brush, we can always use the white acrylic afterwards to add some highlights. And a bit more ultramarine blue. Now you can see you've got those kind of beams or columns, whatever you want to call them. So I'm just throwing in those wet and wet. They will blend a little bit, but actually that blending is quite a nice effect. Looking good so far? Now, a bit more ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson. So not only is this going cooler, but you'll notice this mixture is going thicker. And again, that cadmium yellow to kind of warm it up slightly. And we are adding in these nice deep shadows for that big building in the foreground. Now again, if we find these aren't strong enough, we can always go back. With watercolor, that option is always available to us to go back and make it darker. Now, just got to be careful. Watch out for these chimneys because, they do cast shadows, and we do want to put those in. So it's starting to come together now. You can see these shadows are starting to give the whole thing a bit of shape. I'm going to use the same mixture, even though it's quite dark. I'm on the ground here. And what I'm doing here is I'm trying to cut out, or trying to create a silhouette for these two buildings. Now this is more cadmium yellow, more alizarin crimson, more of everything really. And that gets this kind of brown mixture, which will be useful for these roofs. So notice how the mixture is getting darker the closer I get to the end of the painting. Now, because the brick below this is white, I'm going to be using a cooler shadow, a lot more blue. But for the inside of these windows, I'm just using the same kind of brown mixture. Nice. Ultramarine blue. Now, this is still wet in the background. So because it's still wet, this mixture needs to be thicker than the last one I put on. And when I do that, it blends quite nicely. If you've seen the video on essential watercolor techniques, I talk a lot about the wet on wet technique, one of my favorite techniques, but it can be tricky to master. So I would really recommend watching that if you want to get a better understanding of what I just did there. And the reason I put that in was I wanted to give it a little bit more contrast with that sort of building in front. And the darker I make that background area, the more the stuff in the foreground stands out. So I'm going to use a slightly different part of the pan and just use some ultramarine blue for these shadows here. The reason I used a different part of the pan is because I want it to be a nice, crisp, pure blue. I don't want this kind of mixed mud that we've been making. Mud is useful because mud is basically a type of grey, but for this I wanted that blue. So I'm just continuing to use this mixture here, as it's quite thick, to just go in and add some details within the shadows. A great way to lighten up shadows, if you've done them too dark, is to add in darker paint within the shadow. And now I'm just going for this bridge, because I've noticed from the reference picture the bridge is super, super dark. It's interesting, I'm looking back and actually the river is actually pretty grey, but you know what, that kind of works. I don't really want your attention on the river. So this is a mixture of very, very dark ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow. It doesn't matter, it's quite a nice grey mixture. And I just need to add a tiny bit of the reflections. As this is quite dark, reflections tend to be darker than the actual object itself. I don't mind if this is a bit dark. And again, same thing, I'm trying to cut out that central building there. And the way I cut it out is by adding darker shadows in the background. Just a few details. Going back to this blue mixture in the smaller part of the pan. And you know what? Same thing again. Just adding in a bit of texture there to make those two white buildings pop. Same thing for the roof. When you're painting brick or any kind of building surface, having it too uniform sometimes just looks a bit fake. Kind of looks like a painting. And we sometimes we don't want it to look like a painting. We want it to look kind of a little bit more natural. More ultramarine. But really my goal is just to make this thicker. And because I'm using my smaller paintbrush, I'm just adding in a few of those highlights. I should say the quality of your paints really, really matters when you only use 3 of them. So these are all, I think they're all Daniel Smith paints that I'm using. So they do tend to be a bit more vibrant than others. So we're getting some nice shape here. The next and sort of final stage will be the highlights. So just drying it off there, and I'm just flicking some paint onto my finger with this dark paint, and that just adds a nice splatter effect. Why? No reason. Just looks quite nice. I'll just dry that off. If you want to add the splatter effect, it's quite cool, but it's best to do kind of near the end when the paint is quite thick, because when the splatters are on there, if the paint is too weak, they won't really show up. So I'm just going to dry this off, and the next and final stage will be the highlights. And highlights, I mean the white edges, but also darks as well. And it's really in this final stage that I sort of try to step back and see what needs more shadow. And I think this spire does. So I'm going to go back in with this mixture. I'm just adding in a bit more water. It's still in the background, and I'm just adding in another layer to that spire. And what that does is it pushes it more into the distance and brings out the building in front. It gives you more of the impression that there are 2 different layers. Now, I'm using white acrylic here. And do you remember I said I was trying to cut out some bits of this roof? Where I missed it, or where I think the light is catching the most, just adding in some white acrylic. Apologies, you can't see the tube. So when I pull the brush away out of camera, I'm refilling it with a bit of white acrylic. You can also use white watercolor paint. But this is really useful. So the sun is coming from the right and it's catching these areas here, just on the edge of the roof. And this white acrylic really, really works wonders when we have these nice dark shadows here. Well, it's quite a lot there, but you know what? Actually kind of works. I honestly don't know what I would do with that white acrylic, to be honest. It's like saved me in so many times when I've done this picture and I thought, oh God, this picture is terrible. And then I just added a little bit of white acrylic highlights and suddenly it all comes together. You gotta be really careful how much of this white paint you use. It's so easy just to throw it on everywhere. But you know what, there are things like these chimneys or anything metallic where it's catching. I'm gonna add it on. And almost forgot edges of this spire here. And really this stage, it's just about adding details. And one of those details is the people. Now I didn't really draw these in, but I want to give some life. So I'm just putting in some dots there. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to use some color straight from the pan to add in a few more dots. And those are going to be people. So let's just add a dot of alizarin crimson. And I'm going to put these in here. So because we're at the end of the painting now, we're going with the thickest kind of paint. So, and there's a bit of yellow. And again, we only have 3 colors, so we only have 3 different colors from the pan available to us. And the final one is ultramarine blue. And we just add in a few here. And it just gives the impression that there's kind of a crowd moving around. So there we have it. Pretty happy with that. This has been an urban landscape using just 3 colors. So yeah, I'd recommend giving this a try. As always, I've added in a few additional reference photos. You're also free to use other colors if you want, or another combination of 3 colors. Another favorite of mine is burnt sienna, yellow ochre, and ultramarine blue. Feel free to give that a try as well. But really any kind of combination of yellow, reds, blues would work for this exercise. So thanks again. I will see you next time.